Hello everyone, I am back in my Halloween Takeover toy box today. Last time I finished the build for this mini Disneyland toy box and I hooked up the logic to transform it into the spooky Halloween version. A couple things I forgot though. One was to change the properties on this to turn off 3D sound at speaker or locator. That's going to be important as we go along. And the other was to disable this trigger area here, because we only want to do this transformation once. If we don't deactivate the trigger area and the players wander in and out of it, we will end up clearing replayers that have already been cleared, which will corrupt them, and that would be very bad. So the easiest way to hook that up is just connect to one of these logic gates here. Open up the menu and do a new logic connection on output, and then come back over to the trigger area and deactivate. Okay, and I think that will be sufficient. You only have to do that on one of those logic gates. Okay, today I'm going to start showing you how we restore the toy box. Now the easiest way to do this would be to wait until the very end of the adventure and then just do the reverse of what we did here last time. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to slowly restore parts of the toy box as the players progressed. It would help them feel like they were accomplishing something as they went along, and I thought it would also look pretty cool. And so that's what I'm going to do. And there are two stages to the restoration process. The first stage involves visiting each area of the park and destroying the cauldron that's over there. And this will restore the major landmarks in that area. And along the way, the player will pick up the pumpkin collectibles that they find. Now the second stage involves the confrontation with Maleficent and her capture. Once the player has destroyed all the cauldrons and picked up all the collectibles, then Maleficent appears. And when the player tosses her into the collection pen, then the rest of the park is restored. And that includes the terrain theme, the plants, and the sky dome. Today I'm going to focus on stage 1, okay? And the logic for each area of the park is almost identical. Mainly just a few little differences, but mainly the same. Except for Main Street USA, which is a little bit simpler. And by the way, I have logic diagrams on my blog for today's episode that may help you out, so you may want to follow along on those diagrams as we go. And I forgot to mention in the previous episode, I also have a logic diagram for the transformation logic over here that we hooked up last time. And I'll put a link to that in the video description for the previous episode as well. Okay. So to get started, I have placed some creativitoys that we're going to need ahead of time. So first thing I did was place the cauldron. This is out of the Gameplay Toys drawer. It's from the Brave Forest Siege playset in 2.0. And I placed one here. And I guess probably the most efficient way would be to do each area separately. So we have a logic and a radar marker and a locator. And I also added a time delayer, and I put it in front of the one for the Main Street USA buildings. You'll remember from the previous episode, the replayer on the left as you're facing the landmark is for the pristine version. The one on the right is for the Halloween version. And I put the time delayer purposely in front of the one for the pristine version. Alright, when we come over to Frontierland, I have some locators that I've spread around. And you can note how these are positioned on the ground and where the little blue dot is facing on each of them. And those are all connected to this enemy wave generator. I have a dynamic trigger, a time delayer in front of our pristine replayer again. I've got a locator that I've placed out here in the road. I've got two locators I've placed over here. These are for the boss battle at the end of this area, as well as a enemy wave generator. Our cauldron for this area is back here, and we have another locator, a radar marker, and a logic and. Alright, so for Tomorrowland, I placed a time delayer here in front of the pristine replayer. We have a locator here in the middle of the road. That's connected to an enemy wave generator for the boss battle in this area. We have a logic and, another radar marker with a locator, and a dynamic trigger. And the cauldron for this area is positioned here. And then finally, for the Matterhorn, I have a locator I've placed over here with a enemy wave generator connected to it, a time delayer in front of that replayer, and again a dynamic trigger, a logic and, a radar marker, and a locator. And the cauldron is placed here. Alright, so that's all the toys that I've placed ahead of time, and I've also configured some of these to save a little time. So the cauldron here, I configured the wave to use these enemies. And I also set the properties to take the generation delay to 2 seconds. All of the cauldrons have their properties set the same way. Alright. This cauldron over here, the wave is set up on this to use these enemies and 2 marshmucks. Again, properties set the same way. This enemy wave generator is mainly here because that cauldron is way over there. And when they enter the land, I want a few enemies to greet them right away. So we have this enemy wave generator here for that. This is configured with 1 of each of the western enemies. And this one is connected to those 2 locators, and the wave on this one has the rebuker and the fixer. And by the way, take the generation delay to 0 on all the enemy wave generators. Over in Tomorrowland, this enemy wave generator for the boss battle is configured with the large symbiote. That's how that wave is configured. And the cauldron, the wave on that, has 2 symbiotes, a swarming symbiote, and a symbiote spawn. The enemy wave generator at the Matterhorn for that boss battle has the Wampa. Again, it's connected to that locator there using the new locator connection. And the cauldron here is set up with 2 small frost giants, the small shielded frost giant and the medium frost giant A. Alright, so let's hook up each area here. So the first thing we're going to do is hook up the radar marker, and I'll show you the first one. The others are all configured the same way. So we're going to connect it up to our locator. And the properties on this, the beacon type is going to be a yellow arrow. Beacon location is the locator. Again, same properties set up on all the others. This one's connected up to that locator. The one over here is connected up to the locator next to that. and the one over here connected to the locator next to that. Eventually we're going to move those locators underneath the cauldrons, but for right now it's a lot easier to connect things to them if we leave them there. Okay, so with that, the radar markers are set to go. On each of these time delayers that are in front of the replayers, we want to set the time delayer on that, the time delay, to 2 seconds. So do that for that one. Do it for this one. Ugh, if I can connect to it. We'll do that for, whoops, the one over here. And you get the idea, but I'm going to do this on the video anyway because I don't want you to forget any of these steps. Okay. Alright, so now we're going to plug into the transformation logic. So once the world is transformed, we want to go ahead and turn on those radar markers. And I don't want to plug into this time delayer directly because this is connected to all of the replayers that's going to put the Halloween buildings in. And so I want to wait another 5 seconds before we start initializing the logic for the different areas. So we're going to drop a second time delayer down here. We're going to set that to be 5 seconds. And then we're going to connect this time delayer that we had set up last time that's connected to all those replayers. When that delay is completed, we'll start this one. And then on this time delayer, a new logic connection. When the delay is completed, we're going to come over to each of the radar markers and activate them. All right? You're going to want to make that same connection to every radar marker. So do that for the one over here in Frontierland. And do that for the one in Tomorrowland and over at the Matterhorn as well. And I won't hook those up on the video. You can do that yourself. The other thing we want to do with this time delayer is initialize this first cauldron. Okay? We don't want to do that with the cauldrons in the other areas until the player actually gets into those areas. And that's why we have dynamic triggers in all of the other areas. But for this one, we don't really need a dynamic trigger because the player is going to start right here. So we'll just use this time delayer to kick off that first cauldron. So a new logic connection. When the delay is completed on our new time delayer there, we'll come over to the cauldron and activate it. That'll turn it on and it'll start spawning enemies which will wander around this area. Okay. Now, in order to restore the buildings in this area, we want them to do two things. First, we need to destroy the cauldron. And the other thing we want to make sure we do is defeat all of the enemies that this spawned. And if we don't do that, the enemies could be wandering around where these buildings need to go. And when the replayer tries to play them back, if there's an enemy in the way, or an enemy in the way, it won't put the building there. And so to make sure everything is out of the way, we need to wait until this is destroyed and the enemies. Okay? So what we're going to do on the cauldron is two things. We're going to do a new logic connection. When the wave is defeated, we're going to come into our logic AND here and input. And on the cauldron, a new logic connection. When the generator is destroyed, we'll input into the logic AND. Okay? And then on the logic and, a new logic connection, when this is complete, this will basically finish this area for us. So when that's complete, we want to do several things. First thing we will do is deactivate this radar marker, because we're done with that. Next thing we'll do, when the logic and is complete, we're going to come over to the replayer for the Halloween buildings here at Main Street, USA, and we are going to clear that replayer. All right, and we want to wait 2 seconds for that to happen, which is why we set the properties on that to 2 seconds, because we want to give enough time for this replayer to do its job. So then the next thing this logic and will do is a new logic connection. On complete, we will kick off this time delayer. That will wait 2 seconds. And on the time delayer, a new logic connection. When the delay is completed, then we'll play back the replayer for the Main Street USA buildings. And that will put these buildings back. Okay? Now, the last thing we want to do before we leave this area, because it's mostly done, is we want to record the fact that this area is finished. And so I have another logic and set up way over in Fantasyland. We're going to connect this to that. So when this logic and is done, we'll do a new logic connection. When complete, we're going to come over to the logic and over here at Fantasyland and input into that. Okay? And this logic and is going to tell us when all the areas are done. Alright, so that's it for Main Street USA. That's pretty straightforward. Now, let's start with Tomorrowland as our next land, because this is basically our next area here. So we're going to wait till the player gets over here to start this cauldron. And to do that, we're going to use the dynamic trigger here. So on the dynamic trigger, oh, and by the way, before we forget this, now that we finish this area, let's move this locator underneath the cauldron. Alright, so now in Tomorrowland, we're going to connect up our dynamic trigger here to the same locator that we're using for the radar marker. And for the properties on the dynamic trigger, the target is going to be the locator. And the trigger distance for this, I'm going to set this to be 60. Yeah. So that'll create a radius of 60 distance units around that, which basically puts the player out to about here. So it won't be until they actually enter this land that we kick this off. And it won't matter if they come from that area or they come from here. Okay. Now, when they enter that area, that's when we start this location. So we're going to do on this dynamic trigger a new logic connection. When entered by player, any, we will activate the cauldron. And on the cauldron, a new logic connection. When the first unit is generated, we will deactivate the dynamic trigger, because we're only going to want to do this once. If the player wanders out of this area and comes back, and let's say they've defeated the cauldron, I don't want to restart it. So we'll leave it at that. All right, so we use this to kick it off in each area. Okay, and just like before, we're going to hook this up to that logic and, because we need to wait until both the cauldron is destroyed and the enemies that it generated. So a new logic connection. When the wave is defeated, we input into the logic and, On the cauldron, a new logic connection when the generator is destroyed. Input into the logic and. And then on here, we basically do the same thing that we did at Main Street, USA. So when this is complete, we'll turn off the radar marker. New logic connection when complete. We want to come over here to the replayer for the Halloween buildings in Tomorrowland and clear that. And then we want to kick off that time delayer. New logic connection when complete. Kick off this time delayer, which we already set to 2 seconds. And when that time delayer goes off and the delay is completed, we'll do a playback on the Tomorrowland buildings. And we also need to record the fact that this area is done. So when that's done, we'll come over and input into our logic and over here. And then there's one more thing that we want to do in Tomorrowland, is we want to kick off the final boss battle. And so on the logic and, new logic connection when complete, we'll kick off the enemy wave generator for the boss battle. Okay? And then we can go ahead and move the locator here underneath the cauldron. And there we go. Tomorrowland is done. Over at the Matterhorn. So we'll use this dynamic trigger to begin this. So we're going to hook this locator, or this up to the same locator as our radar marker there. On the properties for this, target will be the locator, and the trigger distance for this one is going to be set again to 60. So on the dynamic trigger, a new logic connection when entered by player any. We kick off the cauldron and activate that. And on the cauldron, a new logic connection when the first unit is generated. We'll deactivate this trigger area, or this dynamic trigger. On the cauldron, new logic connection when the wave is defeated. Input into the logic and. New logic connection, oh, not when wave is generated. Cancel. New logic connection when the generator is destroyed. Input. On output, when that is complete, the logic and is, we'll go ahead and deactivate the radar marker. When that's complete, we will clear the replayer for the Halloween Town building. On the, oops, not the dynamic trigger, on the logic and, new logic connection when complete. Start the time delayer. On the time delayer, new logic connection when the delay is completed. Playback the Matterhorn. On the logic and, new logic connection when complete. Come over here and input into this. New logic connection when complete. Kick off the boss battle. Okay, and that's it for the Matterhorn area. Pretty straightforward. And the last area is Frontierland, and this is a little bit more complicated. Not much, mainly because we have this extra enemy wave generator in here, so I can have some enemies immediately greet the player when they come through that entrance. And it also pulls them over to this area a little bit, because the cauldron's over there, and if players replay this, we don't want them to come in here and just head over there and completely ignore this area. So having a few enemies over here pulls them over this way. And we'll use a collectible later on for that as well. Alright, so for this area we're going to use this dynamic trigger to invoke the logic over here. So this one we're going to connect to this locator in the middle of the street. Whoops, not that. The dynamic trigger. So the properties on here, again, is going to be the locator. And the trigger distance this time, we're going to set this to 80. Which basically gets the player out to about this point. Alright, so new logic connection. When entered by player any, we want to start up this cauldron. And on the cauldron, a new logic connection when the first unit is generated. Deactivate that trigger area, or that dynamic trigger. Now the other thing we want to do here is kick off that enemy wave generator. So this dynamic trigger is going to do something more than the other two did. So when entered by player any, we also want to kick this off, generate that wave. Okay? So this dynamic trigger is a little different than the one over in Tomorrowland and at the Matterhorn, in that it has an extra thing that it's doing here. Alright, on this cauldron, new logic connection. When the wave is defeated, we will input into this logic and. New logic connection when the generator is destroyed, input into this logic and. And on the logic and, new logic connection when that's complete, turn off the radar marker. New logic connection when complete, clear the Halloween Town buildings. On the logic and, new logic connection when complete, kick off this time delayer. On the time delayer, new logic connection when the delay is completed, do a playback on the Thunder Mountain ride there. New logic connection when complete, kick off the boss battle. And a new logic connection when complete, input into this logic and out here. By the way, I think I forgot to move that locator underneath that cauldron. And we'll do the same thing over at Frontierland. Move that locator under that cauldron. Okay, and that's it for Frontierland. So just like the others, the main difference here being the extra enemy wave generator. Okay, and that's the logic for the cauldrons and stage 1 of the restoration process. Now, make sure, because we have those dynamic triggers active by default, that you don't wander into any of those areas while you're building the toy box. So always make sure when you come out of the editor to come back over here to the beginning of the toy box, because this will not be in range of any of those dynamic triggers. And at this point we can go ahead and save our toy box. Another good thing to do is we can put a button here if we want while we're working. And I highly recommend this. I do this in my own toy box here. Is to put down an action button here at the beginning. And you can do a new logic connection when pressed and disable all of the dynamic triggers to turn them off. Okay? And this button is mainly used for when you're working on the toy box. And the idea is I can push that button. That'll turn all of these off. And then I can wander around the toy box and do whatever I need to do without worrying about accidentally invoking any logic. As long as I'm not attacking cauldrons and doing that sort of thing. And so we have that handy if we need it. And I did find that useful while I was building. And when we're all done building the toy box and we move the creativity toys below the terrain, we can take this button and drop it right down here in this little pocket beneath the road, and then it's out of the way. Alright, so that's it for stage 1, as I said. Next time we will work on stage 2, which is the confrontation in Fantasyland with Maleficent. You won't want to miss that, so be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't done that already, and leave a comment before you go to let me know what you think of the logic so far. By the way, let me remind you that I have logic diagrams on my blog that may help you out. Thank you for watching. Take care.